She was not crying. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people, in her situation, would have been. No money, no home, no plan, two sleeping toddlers on her shoulders in 19-degree Chicago wind. But Nora Voss was sitting straight-backed on that park bench, reading a piece of paper under a streetlight, calculating her next move like she was solving a puzzle, not falling apart. Callum Reyes had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone in this city. He had files on senators, judges, crime bosses, and billionaires. But the woman sitting on that bench, with his children, children he did not know existed until this exact moment, had built an entire life, raised two kids, and decoded a 20-year conspiracy, all while staying completely invisible to the most powerful information network in Chicago. He had mapped thousands of people. He had never opened a file on her, and standing there in the cold, looking at that bench, he understood why. Some people you do not map. Some people map you. This channel is about people who were born to lead. There are lessons that no classroom will ever teach you, lessons that only the most powerful minds in the world have learned the hard way. We do not tell stories about crime. We tell stories about mindset, about backbone, and about the secrets behind real power. This story, will show you that the strongest move is not always the aggressive one. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is know exactly what to make invisible, and exactly when to finally let someone see you. If this story made you think differently about strength, about trust, and about what it means to protect someone versus control them, hit that like button, drop a comment below, telling me what moment hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because the next story is already going to change how you see the room you are standing in.
Nora Voss had memorized the location of 34,000 documents, and not one of them told her how tonight was going to end. It was 8 minutes to 9 in the evening. November in Chicago. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan did not care about wind chill charts or human comfort. It simply cut. Through coats, through scarves, through the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying two sleeping toddlers and two overstuffed travel bags for longer than any person should. She was sitting on a bench in Millennium Park, not because she wanted to be there, because the math said she had to be. Nora had run the numbers 3 times on the train from Milwaukee, and 3 times they came out the same. The only shelter option she could afford without a credit card, which she had stopped using 6 weeks ago when she understood that cards leave trails, was the overnight bus station on Harrison Street. But that did not open until 11 p.m. The public library reopened at 9 a.m. Her phone had 14% battery, and Eli had been awake for 19 consecutive hours before he finally dropped off on her left shoulder somewhere around Gary, Indiana. So she sat, back straight, breathing steady, a folded sheet of old paper held in both hands, reading it under the thin light of a park lamp. She was not panicking. She was calculating. 4 hours before the park became the kind of place you did not want to be with small children at night. 2 hours before Eli would wake up hungry. 12 hours until the library. The bus to Harrison Street cost $2.50. She had $47 in cash and a granola bar that was more wrapper than bar at this point. Not a crisis, a problem with a solution. She just had to solve it in the right order. On her left shoulder, Eli slept with his small hand balled into a fist. On her right, Mara had gone limp the way only toddlers can, completely boneless, trusting the universe absolutely. Both of them were wrapped in everything Nora could layer onto a 2-year-old body without losing them inside the fabric. They were warm. That was what mattered. The paper in her hands was a copy she had made 3 weeks ago, before she left Milwaukee, before the library job ended and the apartment lease was suddenly not being renewed, and the man in the gray jacket started appearing on her street at the same hour every morning. The original was sewn into the lining of the smaller travel bag. It was her father's work. Part of it, anyway. the part she had already decoded. Edmund Voss had been a cartographer. That was what his business card said, what his university profile said, what the obituary in the Tribune had said when he died 8 months ago, in what the police called a robbery gone wrong. Case closed in 72 hours, which was, as Nora had known from the moment she heard, about 70 hours too fast. Her father did not get robbed. Her father got silenced. And now someone was looking for what he had left behind. Which was why Nora Voss, 31 years old, former head archivist of the Hargrove Institute, was sitting on a frozen park bench in Chicago at 9 in the evening with twin toddlers and $47 and a map nobody else in the world could read. She had one move left. She had been putting it off for 8 months. She could not put it off anymore. She heard the car before she saw it. A black sedan, slowing on Michigan Avenue. She did not look up immediately. She read the sound first. Engine too quiet for a cab. No music. Slowing with purpose, not with traffic. Then it stopped. Then a door opened. Nora looked up. The man crossing the street toward her wore a gray wool coat and carried no phone in his hand. He walked with a pace that was not fast but covered ground. He was not looking at his feet or at the skyline. He was looking directly at her. She had not seen Callum Reyes in 3 years. She recognized him in the dark before she could have said exactly which feature gave him away. The way he moved, maybe. The way he always moved, like he already knew the floor plan. He stopped 3 feet from the bench. He looked at her. Then at the child on her left shoulder. Then at the child on her right shoulder. In the years she had known him, she had seen Callum Reyes manage crises without raising his voice, read a room full of dangerous people, and walk out unscathed, and sit across from a police commissioner and say nothing while the commissioner sweated. She had never seen him look the way he looked right now. He looked like a man who had just learned something he could not undo. Nora spoke first. Her voice came out level, which she was grateful for. Nora said, "Callum?" Callum said, "Nora." Wind off the lake moved through the empty park. Eli stirred slightly but did not wake. Callum said, "How long have you two been out here?" Nora said, "A couple hours?" He started to say something else, then stopped. She could see him hear the question he had been about to ask and understand why it was the wrong one. Why didn't you call anyone? Because the answer was obvious. She had no one in Chicago to call. Or rather, the one person she could have called was the person she had decided not to call for 3 years. He said, "We need to get inside." That was all. His driver, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s named Dorian, was already out of the car. By the time Nora stood carefully, shifting Mara's weight without waking her, lifting Eli to her chest, feeling every muscle in her back register a protest, Dorian had both travel bags off the ground. 2 child car seats had appeared in the back of the sedan. She did not ask how. She had known Callum long enough to know that Dorian did not wait to be asked. Inside the car, the heat hit her like something she had been pretending she did not need. Callum sat across from her, the width of the back seat between them. Dorian pulled into traffic. The city slid past the windows. Nora looked at the man across from her and said what needed to be said. She said it cleanly, without preamble, because she had rehearsed this in her head for 3 years, and she was too tired for anything but the truth. Nora said, "I am not here because I ran out of options. I am here because my father died, and he left something that I think you need to know about. And because whoever killed him has been following me. They tracked me to Milwaukee." Callum said nothing, listened. Nora said, "Eli and Mara. Those are their names. They are yours. I am not here to ask for anything. I am here because they deserve a father who knows they exist." The silence in the car had a texture to it. Callum did not move. His face did not change in any obvious way. But Nora had spent enough time watching him to know the difference between a man who felt nothing and a man who had learned to keep the feeling where it could not reach his face. He said, "Which one is the boy?" Nora said, "Eli." He looked at the left car seat. Eli was sleeping with his right hand balled up tight. Callum looked at that small fist for a long moment. Then he said, "Did they eat today?" Nora said, "Lunch, not dinner yet." He knocked twice on the partition. Dorian's voice came through. Dorian said, "On it." The car changed direction. Nora looked out the window at Chicago in the dark. She had grown up in this city and left it twice, once for college, once because of the man sitting across from her. She had not planned to come back a third time, but her father had planned it. She was becoming more certain of that by the hour. The apartment Callum arranged for them was on the 14th floor of a building in West Loop. Not his home. A safe address with no name attached to it. Furnished cleanly, kitchen stocked with things that had been bought that same evening. The children ate, they were bathed. They were in beds with actual sheets by 10:30 p.m. Nora stood in the kitchen with a cup of tea. Callum sat at the table by the window. She said, "My father's map. Did you know it existed?" He said, "I knew Edmund was building something. I did not understand the scope." She said, "Do you know how he died? What actually happened?" There was a pause before he answered. Not long, but long enough. He said, "I have some information. Not enough to act on. Not enough to stop thinking about." Nora nodded slowly. She set her cup down on the counter. She said, "Then we have a starting point." She walked to the bedroom where Eli and Mara were sleeping. She checked them the way she always checked them before she slept, which was slowly, touching each of them once on the back to feel the rise and fall. Then she closed the door softly and did not come back out. Callum stayed at the kitchen table. In front of him, 2 cups. His, empty. Hers still half full and cooling. Full and... He had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone in Chicago. This woman had built a complete life in 3 years without leaving a single data point he could find. Not because she had hidden cleverly, because she had understood exactly what to make invisible and had done it without hesitation. That, Callum thought, was the most important thing he had learned tonight. And it was not something you learned about a person from a file. He was at the kitchen table when Mara found him. It was 7 in the morning. Callum had slept on the couch, which was not something he did. He had a perfectly good apartment 12 blocks away. He had chosen not to go there. He had told himself it was about security. He was not entirely sure that was true. Mara came out of the bedroom at 6:45, feet padding on the wood floor, hair going in 4 directions, holding nothing. She climbed up into the chair across from him and sat there. She looked at him with the direct, unafraid gaze of a person who has not yet learned that staring is considered rude. She said, "Hungry." He said, "Okay." He went to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. Dorian had stocked it the night before with enough food for a week, which was useful, but it did not immediately tell him what a 2-year-old ate for breakfast, or in what configuration. He thought about what Nora had told him. Eli would not eat if the food touched on the plate. He assumed that applied to Mara as well. He scrambled 2 eggs. He put them on a small plate. He put 2 pieces of toast on a separate plate. He placed both plates on the table with deliberate space between them. Mara looked at the arrangement. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you." Then she started eating. Eli came out of the bedroom a minute later, carrying a small plastic truck. He saw Callum at the stove. He looked at his sister eating. He sat down on the kitchen floor next to the table, not at the table, and started rolling the truck back and forth, not asking for anything, just occupying the space like it belonged to him. Callum looked at the boy on the floor and thought, against his will, about the particular quality of that silence. Eli was comfortable in a room without filling it. He did not need acknowledgement. He did not seek attention. He simply existed in a space and let the space be what it was. Callum had been that kind of child. His mother used to say he could sit in a room for an hour without making a sound, and you would forget he was there until he said something that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. He made a second plate. He set it on the floor beside Eli, on the side away from the truck. Toast on one plate, eggs separated. Eli looked at it, looked up at Callum, then ate without comment. Nora came out 20 minutes later, already dressed, hair pulled back. She read the room in about 4 seconds. Then she looked at Callum with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite the absence of it. Nora said, "You remembered what I said about the plates." Callum said, "I retain useful information." She looked at him for one more moment, then sat down. The map went out on the table after both children were settled in the next room, with toys Dorian had bought that morning before 7 a.m. Nora unfolded it carefully. She smoothed the edges. She had handled this paper so many times in the last 8 months that the fold lines were soft. Callum stood across the table. She explained it the way a person explains something only once, because the person they are explaining it to is paying complete attention. Her father was a cartographer. That was not a cover. It was real. Edmund Voss had spent 30 years making beautiful, precise maps of cities and neighborhoods and historical districts. He was respected. He was published. He was genuinely good at what he did. He was also, for 20 of those years, building a second archive alongside the first. The map on the table looked like a standard geographic survey. Topographic notation, elevation markers, street designations. Someone who did not know Edmund would look at it and see exactly that. Nora saw something different. The topographic symbols were a private language Edmund had developed over years. He had taught it to Nora when she was 9 years old, framing it as a game. Bedtime codes, secret messages and maps. She had loved it. She had not understood until 8 months ago that her father had been preparing her. Each symbol that looked like elevation data was a person or a relationship. Each notation that looked like a street marker was a date or a transaction. The map was not a map of Chicago. It was a map of a network. 20 years of connections, money, decisions, and the people who made them. Nora told him this steadily. Callum listened without interrupting. She said, "3 names appear in the section I have decoded so far." She pointed to the first. She said, "Senator Harlan Mast." Callum said nothing, but a small muscle near his jaw moved. She noted it. She pointed to the second. She said, "Marcus Webb. He was my father's former colleague." Callum gave a slow nod. She pointed to the third. She looked up at him before she said it. She said, "Danny Reyes." The room was very quiet. Callum did not move. His hands were flat on the table. She watched him take in that name and hold it. She said, "My father tracked him for 6 years after Danny disappeared. Callum, Danny is alive. He has been living under a different name, in a different place, and he chose that." The silence continued for a moment that was not comfortable, but was necessary. Then Callum walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was level, but it was level the way a surface is level when someone has worked very hard to make it so. He said, 9 years. I looked for him for 9 years. I believed he was dead." Nora said, "I know," he said. "Your father knew he was alive and said nothing." She stood. She walked to the window and stood beside him, not touching him, just there. She said, "My father said nothing because Danny did not want to be found, not by anyone, especially not by you." He said, "Why?" She said, "I have not decoded that part yet, but the map has coordinates. The path is there, if you want the answer." He was quiet for a long time, watching the street below, a delivery truck, 2 joggers, the ordinary morning of a city that did not know what was happening in this apartment. Then he said, "What do you know about how your father died? What they are not saying?" This was the question she had been expecting him to turn back to. He told her, not everything, the part that mattered. 1 week before Edmund Voss died, Callum had received a report. Edmund's name had appeared in a monitored conversation. The context was not fully clear. Could have been a target. Could have been a reference. He had assessed the risk as low. He had not issued a warning because he did not want to alarm Edmund based on incomplete information. He had told himself he would confirm it first. Edmund was dead 6 days later. Callum said, "I have been living with that question for 8 months, whether I assessed it differently." Nora let that sit in the room. Then she said, "What are you offering me?" He turned from the window. He looked at her directly. He said, "Work with me to finish decoding the map and find what your father hid. In return, I will guarantee safety for you, for Eli and Mara, and for your brother Jake in Boston." She said, "And when it is over?" He said, "You decide, not me." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 8 months she had spent in Milwaukee, making herself small, keeping her children safe, trying to figure out what her father had left her and why. She thought about the man in the gray jacket who had started appearing on her street. She thought about the library job ending and the lease not being renewed and the $47 in her coat pocket. She thought about her father, about the fact that Edmund Voss had arranged for that map to survive. He had made sure it would be donated to the archive where his daughter worked. On a shift she would be working. He had set all of this up years in advance. Edmund had planned for her to end up in this room. She said, "2 conditions. 1. Eli and Mara stay with me at all times. You do not move them anywhere without asking me first. They are yours, but they have lived with me for 3 years. I am who they trust. You do not change that overnight." He said, "Agreed." She said, "2. If you learn anything that affects our safety, you tell me immediately. Not after you calculate whether it serves the mission. Immediately." He held her gaze. He understood what she was saying. She was not asking for information updates. She was asking him not to repeat the thing he had already done once, not to decide on her behalf what she was allowed to know. He said, "Agreed." She said, "Then we start tomorrow morning." She went back to the room where Eli and Mara were playing. She sat on the floor with them and did not think about the map for 1 hour. That was all she needed. 1 hour where she was just their mother and nothing else. That was a luxury, she knew, one she could not afford to take too often. From the kitchen, she heard the sound of Callum making a phone call. His voice low, precise, brief. She heard the words perimeter and confirmed, and she knew he was already working. She did not thank him. She put a wooden block in Eli's hand and watched him study it with the seriousness of a tiny engineer. Her father had been right about one thing. Callum Reyes was the only person in Chicago with the resources and the reasons to finish this. Whether he was also more than that was a question she was not ready to answer yet. Callum's real office was on the 14th floor of an unremarkable building in West Loop. No name on the door, no receptionist, no logo in the lobby. The building directory listed a consulting firm that did not appear in any public business registry. Nora came the next morning with Eli in a carrier on her chest, and Mara walking beside her, holding her hand with the grip of a child who knows exactly how much trouble she can get into if she lets go. Dorian met them at the elevator. He crouched down to Mara's level and said, "Hey there, you want to see the fun room?" Mara studied him with the analytical precision of a 2-year-old determining trustworthiness. Then she let go of Nora's hand and followed him. The adjoining room was small, but it had been prepared. A low table, building blocks, a stack of picture books, a soft mat on the floor. Dorian settled in with a novel, completely at ease, a man who had 7 grandchildren and no anxiety about small people whatsoever. Nora stepped into the main office. She had been in many archives and workspaces in her career. She had seen offices designed to intimidate, designed to impress, designed to communicate status. This was none of those things. This was a space built entirely around function. Maps on every wall. Chicago through the decades, 1871 through 2015, hung at reading height, lit by good overhead light. Filing cabinets along one wall, labeled in a system she recognized immediately as a real archival system, not a decorative one. A desk positioned to face the window, which faced north and gave natural light for most of the working day. And between the city maps, interspersed at irregular intervals, a handwriting she knew. She walked closer. She reached out and touched one of them, not to take it, just to feel the paper. She said, "This is my father's work." Callum said, 12 years of it. He updated every quarter." She said, "He never showed me any of these." He said, "He was protecting you." She looked at him. Her voice did not change. She said, "He was wrong. Not about the danger, about the fact that it was his decision to make." Callum did not argue. He heard that sentence and filed it somewhere. She walked back to the desk. She took the map from her bag. They started. The way they worked was the thing that would have surprised anyone who had not seen both of them at their actual jobs. Nora decoded fast. She had been doing this for 8 months, since she first found the map in that donated document box at the archive, since she had recognized her father's private language and understood what it was. She spoke clearly, without wasted words. This symbol here was a person. This notation was a date. This elevation marking, when cross-referenced with the pattern here, indicated a financial transaction of the size and type that left no public record. Callum listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions that she was about to answer anyway. And when she named a location or a connection, he walked to the filing cabinet, opened a specific drawer, counted to a specific folder, and pulled out exactly what was needed. The third time he did this, she stopped. She said, "You organize by the same system my father used." He said, "He taught me." A pause, not long. But she was an archivist. She understood what it meant when someone shared their organizational language with another person. That was not professional courtesy. That was trust at a very specific level. She went back to the map. At 10 minutes to 11, Mara appeared in the doorway. She was carrying a picture book with a giraffe on the cover, and she walked directly to Callum with the focused purpose of someone who has made a decision. She said, "Read." Nora said, "Not right now, Mara. He is working." The room went still in a particular way. Nora heard herself say the word he, the way she had said it, without thinking, as though the word belonged there naturally. Callum crouched down so he was at Mara's eye level. He said, 15 minutes. Can you give me 15 minutes? Mara considered this with complete seriousness. Then she said, "'Kay." She pressed the book into his hands like collateral and walked back out. Callum set the book on his desk, not on the file stack, on the desk itself, in front of him where he would see it. Nora watched him do that and did not say anything. They had been working for 2 hours when the full picture began to emerge. Edmund Voss had not simply been mapping the underworld's social network. Anyone with enough time and access could do that. What Edmund had done was something far more deliberate. He had been mapping evidence. Every transaction that appeared as a symbol on that map had a corresponding record. A date, a location, an amount, documentation of where the money had come from and where it had gone. 20 years of financial connections between political decisions and criminal funding. Enough to show, in specific and verifiable terms, how certain contracts had been awarded, how certain careers had been built, how certain investigations had been quietly closed. And Edmund had not kept that evidence in one place. He had divided it into 7 sections and hidden each one at a different location around Chicago and beyond. The map was not the evidence. The map was the guide to finding it. Nora stared at it for a long moment. Then she said, "He built a library." Callum said, "He built a bomb." She looked up. She said, "And he left the detonator to me." Callum looked at her across the table. Not the look he gave information. Something different. Something she had not seen from him in a long time. He said, "He trusted you with the most important thing he ever built." She looked back at the map. She said, "Or he had no other option." He said, "With Edmund, those were the same thing." At 11 o'clock exactly, which was 15 minutes from when he had promised, Callum picked up the giraffe book and walked into the next room. Nora stood at the door and watched. He sat down on the floor, not in one of the chairs. On the floor, cross-legged, next to where Mara was sitting. Eli was nearby with his truck. Callum opened the book. He read aloud. His voice was not the voice of a man who read to children regularly. The rhythm was slightly stiff. He paused at the wrong moments. He did not do the different voices that Mara clearly expected, based on the look she gave him when he read the lion's dialogue in the same tone as the narrator. She took the book from him. She showed him how it was supposed to sound. Her version involved significant dramatic emphasis and considerable arm movement. He tried again. It was better. Not great, but better. Mara said, "Better." That was apparently a passing grade. Nora stood at the door and thought about her father, about the fact that Edmund Voss had spent 15 years tracking Callum Reyes, had spent 15 years watching and documenting and building a picture of who this man was, not just what he did. Edmund did not spend years mapping something he thought was worthless. He mapped what mattered. He was very clear about that. She watched Callum turn a page and listen, with genuine attention, as Mara corrected his pronunciation of the word giraffe, which Mara apparently felt strongly about. Her father had seen something in this man, something she was only beginning to see herself. She turned back to the map. She was decoding the fourth quadrant when she found Danny, not as a name, as a symbol cluster that, when she read it the way her father had taught her, described a person who had worked in financial operations, who had been building a private case file, who had vanished from one life and appeared under a different name in another city. She said, "I found something about Danny." Callum came back to the table. She read it to him. She read the whole section out loud slowly. She stood on the same side of the table as him and held the map between them so they were both looking at it from the same angle. Because this was not information. This was someone's brother. And you did not deliver that kind of thing across a table like a report. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long time. Callum stared at the map. His hands were very still. She stood close, not touching him, just present. Then he said quietly, "Your father mapped everyone he lost. He was very thorough." She said, "He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he had." The words surprised her when she heard herself say them. But they were true. She had known that about her father for years without ever quite putting it into words. Callum looked at the map for a moment longer. Then he straightened and stepped back from the table. He said, "There are 3 more location clusters to decode. Can you finish them today?" She said, "By tomorrow morning." He said, "Then let us come back here tomorrow. I will bring food this time." She said, "You do not have to?" He said, "I know I do not have to." He said it simply, and went back to his desk, and that was the end of that conversation. On the third day, Nora needed to go alone to the Hargrove Institute. There was something in the physical archive she needed to check. Something that could not be verified remotely. A document format her father had used that required the original, under good light, to read correctly. She explained this to Callum at 7 in the morning. He said, "How long?" She said, 3 hours, maybe 4. He said, "I will stay with them." She looked at him. She ran the assessment she always ran, quickly, in her head. She said, "Eli will not eat if his food is touching. Mara needs you to read the same page twice before she will let you turn it. If Eli falls and you make a big deal of it, he will cry more. If you act like it is nothing, he will act like it is nothing." He said, "I understand." She said, "You understand the theory." He said, "I know, but they will be safe." She looked at him for one more second. Then she went to the bedroom and said goodbye to her children, who were eating cereal with the focused intensity of small people who had discovered that cereal required full concentration. Callum alone with 2 toddlers. Eli found him first, which was notable because Eli did not usually find people. People found Eli, and then Eli decided what he thought of them. But Eli came into the kitchen with his truck under his arm and placed himself a few feet away from where Callum was standing at the counter, and just stood there. After a moment, Callum crouched down. He said, "Hey." Eli looked at him. He held out the truck. Not to give, to show. "This is what I have. What do you have?" Callum said, "That is a good truck." Eli took the truck back. He sat down on the kitchen floor and went back to his private business. Callum went back to making breakfast. The plates went out, eggs separated from toast. Eli examined his plate with the thoroughness of an inspector and appeared to find it satisfactory. Mara came out and immediately requested a story. Callum said, "After we eat." Mara said, "Now." He said, "After we eat." She looked at him. She appeared to be calculating. Then she sat down and ate her eggs at a pace that suggested she intended to be finished before anyone had time to forget the story request. He read the giraffe book 3 times. On the second reading, Mara had notes. On the third, she demonstrated certain passages herself and then watched critically while he replicated them. He was improving. Eli, from the other side of the room where he had been silently observing, said, "More." It was the first direct word he had said to Callum. Callum looked at him. He said, "More of which book?" Eli pointed at the giraffe book. Callum read it a 4th time. Nora came back at 1 in the afternoon. She opened the door and found Eli asleep on the sofa with a blanket over him. Mara was asleep in Callum's lap, one hand still wrapped around the corner of a picture book. Callum was sitting very still so as not to disturb her, which meant he had been sitting in that position for however long it had taken Mara to fall asleep. He looked up when Nora came in. He said, "I read Eli the Chicago street maps as a bedtime story. He was asleep in about 15 minutes. Nora said, "You read him road maps." He said, "It worked." She looked at the way he was sitting, straight-backed, careful, holding the weight of the sleeping child with the focused attention of someone for whom this was new and who was determined to do it correctly. There was something in that image that she did not have immediate words for. She put down her bag and went to the kitchen to make tea. That evening, after the children were settled, Nora's phone rang. It was Jake, her brother, calling from Boston, his voice easy and warm, telling her about a hiking trip his friend group was planning for the weekend, about a paper he had just submitted, about a dinner he had made that had turned out better than expected. She stood in the hallway and listened and smiled, and the smile was real because it was Jake, and Jake was the part of her life that had remained entirely intact. When she hung up, she went back to the main room. Callum was at the table with his notebook. He said, "He does not know." Not a question. Nora said, "He is in his final year. He has a thesis and a life that has nothing to do with any of this." Callum said, "He will find out eventually." Nora said, "Eventually is not now." He looked at her then, not with judgment, with something more uncomfortable than judgment, recognition. He said, "Your father did the same thing, kept everyone safe by keeping them in the dark." She said, "Is that a warning or a comparison?" He said, "An observation. The Voss family has a pattern." She said, "That pattern kept Jake intact." He said, "That same pattern kept your father facing all of it alone." A long pause. She looked at her hands on the table. She did not deny what he said. She said, I know that, but this is my call to make, and I am trying not to repeat his mistake in other areas." He nodded. He did not push further. She found Danny's full file that night. It was in the second-to-last section of the map, encoded in a cluster of symbols her father had reserved for what he called lost coordinates. People who had been in the network and were now somewhere else. People the map needed to account for but no longer tracked. Danny Reyes had worked in finance. He had been sharp, methodical, invisible in the way that people who move money often learn to be. He had been building a case file on his own against the same people Callum had been watching for years. He had not told Callum because he was afraid Callum would stop him. He had not been wrong about that. What Edmund had found was the sequence of events after Danny vanished, the transfer, the new documentation, the city 900 miles away, the name Danny now used for his quiet life, and a note, in Edmund's private language, that translated roughly to, "He asked me never to say. I am honoring that. But I am also recording it so that someday, if it matters, someone will know." Nora stood up from the table and walked to where Callum was working at his desk. She did not hand him the map across the distance of the table. She walked around to his side. She placed the map between them so they were looking at it together. And she read him the section aloud, the way she would read someone a letter they had been waiting for. When she finished, he did not speak. She stood there beside him, not touching him, just close, just present. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Then he said very quietly, He mapped everyone he lost. Your father was very thorough, she said. He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he knew. Callum turned his head and looked at her, just for a moment. Then he looked back at the map. He said, I need to think about the retrieval sequence for the 7 locations. Can we go over the full map tomorrow? She said, yes. She gathered her notes and walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at Chicago at night. The grit of it. Her father had loved this city. He had spent his whole life mapping it. She thought, he mapped it so well that even his last message was a map. And the destination was this room, this moment, this very specific configuration of people. She wondered, not for the first time, if that was an accident. She was becoming more certain it was not. On the morning of day 5, Nora walked into the Hargrove Institute and knew within 30 seconds that someone had been there. She did not notice a broken lock or a displaced security seal. She noticed a document box on shelf 7C that had been opened and replaced. To every other person who worked in that archive, the box would look undisturbed. It was exactly where it had been. The lid was on. But it was on 1/4 turn clockwise from where Nora always placed it. She had placed every box in that archive. She had her own system, she noticed. She did not call the police. She called Callum. He arrived in 18 minutes, which told her something about how seriously he took the word security issue at the archive. He came through the front entrance as a researcher. He signed in. He carried a notebook. He was, to all appearances, a man who had come to look at documents. He was also reading the entire ground floor in one slow scan before he was halfway through the door. Nora met him in the reading room. She kept her voice even. She explained what she had found. He walked to the shelf. He looked. He did not touch the box. He looked at the shelf below it, the shelf above, the angle from the loading dock entrance, the position of the single security camera at the far end of the corridor. He said, the loading dock camera has a 14-second blind spot every hour on the hour. Whoever came in knew that. She said, you mapped this building. He said, I map every building where people I am responsible for spend time. She said, when did I get on that list? He said, 3 years ago. He said it without hesitation or defensiveness, which was, she was learning, how Callum delivered facts that other people might try to soften. He said, I was not watching you, but I knew you worked here when you left. I wanted to know the building was safe. She absorbed this. Then she said, so, whoever came in last night, you can find out who. He said, I already have some idea, but I need to confirm it. I need to meet someone. He looked at her. He said, you can come if you want. She said, yes. The woman they met was named Margaret Holt. She ran 3 dry cleaning stores on the north side, and she knew everything that moved through the informal networks of the neighborhoods they served. She was 52 years old, wore practical clothing, drank her tea plain, and had the economy of a person who had long ago decided that words were expensive. They met her at a diner on Armitage Avenue. Nora sat beside Callum. Margaret sat across. Margaret looked at Nora for a long time. Then she said, you're Edmund's daughter. Nora said, you knew him. Margaret said, everyone who mattered knew Edmund Voss. She turned back to Callum. Her voice dropped slightly. The person who was at that archive last night is not independent. They are working for someone who has been quiet for a long time, very intentionally quiet. She looked at Nora. They do not want the map. They want her, because she is the only one who can read it. Once they have the location of the evidence, she becomes a liability. Nora said, how soon? Margaret said, soon enough that you should not be going to that archive alone. She finished her tea. She placed exact change on the table. She left. Callum watched her go. Then he looked at Nora. He said, you understand what that means? She said, it means the timeline just changed. He said, it means we need the full map decoded by the end of this week. They walked back toward the car through a side street, moving into the wind off the lake. Nora kept her hands in her pockets. She had been turning a thought over in her mind for 3 days. She said it now. She said, "My father did not do this just because you asked him to. He was doing it for his own reasons, wasn't he?" Callum said, "Yes." She said, "He saw something 20 years ago." He said, "He told me once that he had watched a city being built on a foundation that most people could not see. He said that someone had to keep a record, not to destroy it, to ensure the truth did not disappear when the people who knew it were gone." She said, "He knew this might get him killed." Callum said, "He believed it was possible eventually." She said, "He should have told me." Callum said, "Maybe. Or maybe he knew that if he told you earlier, you would have tried to stop him, and he could not be stopped." She walked in silence for a moment. Then she said, "A man who spends 20 years doing dangerous work because he believes it matters, and the daughter who is not allowed to know." She said it the way she decoded maps, piece by piece. "That is not protection. That is arrogance." Callum said, "Yes," she said, "but the work got done, and I am here to finish it." She looked straight ahead. "So I can be angry at him, or I can finish what he left. I cannot do both at the same time." He said, "Most people choose anger." She said, "Most people do not have a 2-year-old who needs dinner." A beat. Then he almost smiled. It was brief and he covered it quickly, but she saw it. That evening, while Eli and Mara were in the bath, her phone rang. It was a Boston number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. Then she did. A woman's voice, steady. She said she was calling from the property management office of a building near Boston University. She was looking to confirm a forwarding address for a Jake Voss. Nora said, "What is the reason for the contact?" The woman said there had been some questions from a third party about the tenant's current location. Nora said, "What kind of third party?" The woman said she was not able to share that information. Nora hung up. She went back to the main room. Callum was at his desk. She stood in the doorway and said, "Someone just contacted Jake's building management in Boston, asking for his forwarding address." Callum's hand was already on his phone. He said, "I will handle it." He made 2 calls, each under 90 seconds. She heard the words "watch on him, passive only, report changes." She said, "You are putting someone on Jake." He said, quietly, "He will not know they are there." She said, "He will not like that." He said, "He does not need to like it. He needs to be safe." She did not argue with that. She stood in the doorway and watched him work, and thought about the difference between the 2 versions of this kind of power she had encountered in her life. The version that kept information as currency and used it to control, and the version that kept information as currency and used it to protect. The work looked identical from the outside. The person doing it made all the difference. They were on day 7 when they finished decoding the full map. All 7 locations, 3 in Chicago, 1 in Milwaukee, where Edmund had lived for a period in his early 40s, 1 in Springfield, which was practical given its proximity to the state capital, 1 in New York, held at a private research foundation where Edmund had a decades-old access credential, and the 7th, Boston, the main research archive at the public library, 3 blocks from where Jake studied. Nora looked at that last coordinate for a long time. She said, "He put a piece in Boston." Callum said, "I know." She said, "Jake does not know any of this." He said, "No, but whoever is looking will work out the connection. It is not a difficult deduction." She looked at the map. She said, "He put it there because it would be safe, because no one would connect a graduate student with his dead cartographer father's work." Callum said, "And because he knew that eventually, if it came to it, you would tell Jake what he needed to know. He was counting on you to judge when that time was." She folded the map. Callum had sent Dorian to pick up dinner from the Polish restaurant on the next block. He brought it back while the children were finishing a bath that Mara was extending by inventing increasingly improbable reasons why it could not end yet. When both children were asleep, Nora and Callum sat at the desk with the food between them, and, for the first time since she had arrived, there was no map on the table. She asked him where he had learned to read maps. Not as an interrogation. It came out the way questions come out when you have been working closely with someone for a week and you realize there are things you do not know about them that you want to know. He told her about Andrew, an old Polish man who had been a librarian at the Pilsen branch for 30 years. He had found Callum there as a teenager, sitting in a corner reading city maps for reasons he could not have articulated at the time, and had spent the next 2 years teaching him that maps were not just records of geography, they were records of intention. They showed what people valued, what they feared, where they moved, and why. He said, Andrew used to say, "Show me where a person lives, where they work, where they eat, where they go at night, and I will show you everything about them that their own words will never tell you." She said, "My father used to quote that almost exactly." He said, "I know. He met Andrew through me. We all used to sit in that branch library on Tuesday evenings for a while. Your father and Andrew would argue about the symbolism in medieval European maps for hours." She looked at him. There was something strange and not entirely comfortable about this image. Her father, younger, sitting in a library on Tuesday nights with the man now sitting across from her, and an elderly Polish cartographer arguing about symbolism. She said, "How long did you know each other?" He said, 15 years. He came to me right after Danny disappeared. He was the only person outside my organization who knew where to find me. A pause. He said he had been watching me work for years and that he had one observation. He said I was the only person he had seen who used information to protect people rather than use them, and that because of that, he thought I was worth helping. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Did Nora, 3 years ago, did she ever hear any of this?" He said, "No." She said, "Why not?" He took his time with this answer. He said, "Because I had convinced myself that protecting someone meant not letting them know the parts that were dangerous." She said, "Same as my father." He said, "Yes, we were wrong in exactly the same way." She said, "You understand that now?" He said, "I have understood it for a while. Understanding it and having changed because of it are not the same thing." It was, she thought, one of the most honest things he had ever said to her. His phone buzzed. He looked at it and his posture changed. Not dramatically, but she had spent enough time watching him to read the shift. He stood up. He made 4 calls in 7 minutes. His voice was quiet and fast and precise, the way it became when something needed to happen now rather than later. He paced a short track between the desk and the window. He gave instructions without repeating himself. She watched him work. What she noticed was not the efficiency, though the efficiency was real. What she noticed was this. In the middle of the 4th call, he turned and looked at her. Not to see if she was all right, not to check a perimeter. He looked at her the way you look at something that anchors you when things are moving fast. He looked at her the way she looked at Eli and Mara when she was under pressure. Not because he needed anything from her, because she was there, and her being there was enough. When he was done, he stood at the window. She walked over and stood beside him. She said, "Everyone okay?" He said, "They will be. Tonight should fix it." They stood looking at the city, the grid of it. 20 floors below, people moving in every direction, living entirely unaware of the information networks that ran through Chicago like a second set of pipes beneath the street. She said, "How long have you been doing this alone?" He said, 11 years. She said, "Are you tired?" A beat. He said, "Yes, but not the kind tired that sleep fixes." She said, "I know that kind of tired." The space between them was not large. It was not nothing. He turned to look at her. He said, "Nora, I want to say something while things are quiet." She said, "Say it." He said, "I have no right to expect anything from you. From what happened or from what might happen. But I want you to know that these 3 years I did not forget. And the reason I did not come looking was not that I could not find you. It was because respecting your choice was the only thing left I could give you. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, I know, my father's map. You are in it, Callum, not as a threat or a complication, as someone he wanted me to find. She said it and let it sit there. He did not respond right away. He turned back to the window. She turned back to the window too. They stood there until the city outside had settled into its late-night rhythm and the apartment was fully quiet. Later, she would think about that hour the way you think about the last good day before a season changes. You do not know it is the last one until it is already behind you. Marcus Webb called her. Not through Callum. Her direct number, which she had given to almost no one since Milwaukee. She did not know how he had it. She was going to ask that question when she got in front of him. He said he needed to meet. Alone. He said there was something she needed to know before she made any further decisions about how she and Callum were going to handle the evidence. He said it was something Callum had not told her. He said one more thing. He said, Your father trusted me with certain things before he died. This is one of them. She went. She did not tell Callum, not. Lincoln Park, midday. Cold enough that most of the benches were empty. Marcus Webb was already there when she arrived. He was 58 and looked older. He wore a heavy coat and a scarf and held a paper cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. He had the look of someone who had not slept well in a long time. She sat beside him. She said, How do you have my number? He said, Your father gave it to me 2 weeks before he died. She said, Tell me what you came to say. He said, 1 week before Edmund died, a man who works for Callum Reyes intercepted a conversation. In that conversation, your father's name was mentioned, specifically, as a target, not as a source of information, as someone who needed to be dealt with. She did not speak. He said, Callum received that report. He assessed the risk and did not act on it. He did not warn your father. She said, How do you know this? He said, Because I work adjacent to people who knew about the report. It was not a secret within the organization. What was a secret was what Callum decided to do with it. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the lake, flat and gray in the midday light. She said, Why are you telling me this now, 8 months later? He said, Because I have been sitting on it and it has been eating at me, and I could not watch you work with him as though this did not happen. She said, So your conscience brought you here? He said, Something like that. She turned to look at him. She said, If Callum has a part in this, then so do you. You knew about it. You stayed quiet for 8 months. That is also a choice. So what I am trying to understand is whether you are here to help me or to help yourself. Webb did not have a clean answer to that. He looked into his cold coffee. She stood up. She said, Thank you for telling me. She walked away. She went straight to Callum's office. She did not call ahead. She walked in. Phil held the door with his usual quiet efficiency. She went up the elevator and through the outer room and into his office. He was at his desk. He looked up. She said, Did you receive a specific report about my father? His name in an intercepted conversation. As a target. He looked at her. A pause. Brief. But there. Brief. But she had been reading documents for 12 years. She knew what a pause before an answer meant. She said, Tell me. He said, I received a report. Edmund's name had come up in a monitored conversation. The context was not completely clear. It could have been a designation as a target. It could have been something else. I assessed the risk as low and decided not to trigger a warning based on incomplete information. She said, And he died 6 days later. He said, Yes. She said, You have known this for 8 months. He said, Yes. She said, You sat in this room with me for an entire week. You ate with me. You worked with me. You let me read the maps my father spent 20 years building. You held my daughter while she slept. And the entire time you knew you had information that might have saved him, and you chose not to act on it. And then you chose not to tell me. He said, I know. She said, Why? He said, I was afraid that if you knew, you would stop, and I needed you to finish decoding the map. It landed the way true things land, not like an accusation, like a fact. She said, "At least that is honest." She stood looking at him. She had spent 8 months being careful, carrying everything alone, managing her grief and her fear and her children and this impossible inheritance her father had left her. She had come back to Chicago, and she had put herself in this room with this man because her father had trusted him, and she had been beginning to understand why. And now she was standing here with this. She said, "My father trusted you. Even knowing what you are and what you have done and what you are capable of, he trusted you." Callum said, "I know." She said, "I am trying to figure out whether he was right." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something shifted in his posture. He said, "Someone connected to Mast just made inquiries at Jake's building in Boston, in person this time, not by phone." He was already dialing. 2 calls, under 3 minutes. She heard Jake's name once and then heard Callum directing someone in Boston to move Jake to a different location for the next 48 hours. She stood there and watched him do it, watched him protect Jake without being asked, without making it a condition of anything, just doing it because it needed to be done. When he was finished, she was already putting on her coat. He said, "Nora." She said, "Jake is safe. That is what matters right now." He said, "I should have told you sooner." She said, "Yes." She stopped at the door. "You have everything you need from the map. You can finish this without me." He said, "That is not—" She said, "Good night, Callum." She walked out. The door closed behind her. Callum sat in the office after she left. He looked at the door. He looked at the map. He looked at the corner of the room where Eli had been playing with his truck that morning. He looked at the 2 cups on the desk. His, empty. Hers, left behind with tea still in it. He had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone in Chicago. He had calculated, with the precision that was both his greatest skill and his greatest flaw, exactly what it would cost her to learn what he had held back. He had told himself the mission came first. He had known, with that same precision, that he was lying to himself. There was a difference between protecting someone and controlling what they knew. He had always understood that difference in theory. Understanding something in theory and living it were 2 entirely different things. He picked up the cup she had left. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it back down. In 11 years, the right thing had usually been clear to him. The cost of the right thing had occasionally surprised him. But the right thing itself, usually he could see. Tonight, sitting in his empty office in the dark, he thought about Edmund Voss, about a cartographer who had mapped everything carefully and left instructions for his daughter, and trusted a man who had failed him once to be worthy of that trust a second time. He thought about whether he was. He did not have an answer yet. 3 days without her. Callum worked. He had learned long ago that work was the most reliable structure during uncertain periods. Work had a logic. It moved forward. It produced results that were measurable, that meant something, that could be confirmed and acted on. On the first day without Nora, he spent 4 hours with his full network, cross-referencing everything they had decoded from the map against the movement patterns he had been tracking on Mast's organization for the past year. The picture that emerged was clearer than he had expected. Mast was accelerating. The gubernatorial campaign was gaining momentum, and Mast needed the evidence Edmund had built to stay buried. The timeline was weeks, maybe less. On the second day, Callum met Marcus Webb. He met him at the bar on Damon, where Webb had been going every Thursday for 20 years. Webb was already there when Callum arrived. He looked like a man who had been expecting this conversation and had not been looking forward to it. Callum sat down across from him. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He said, "Tell me what you told her." Webb told him. Callum listened to the whole thing. When Webb finished, Callum was quiet for a moment. He said, "What was your reason for telling her now?" Webb said, "Because she deserved to know." Callum said, Before or after you calculated what it would do to her trust in me? Webb said, both, if I am being honest. He paused. Callum, Edmund spent 15 years watching you. He watched you do things that were not good. He watched you make decisions that cost people. And he kept watching. He kept mapping you. He never stopped. Callum said, I know. Webb said, do you know why? Callum said, no. Webb said, because you were the only person in this city's underworld who Edmund believed could still change the direction he was going. He thought you were worth watching because he thought you were worth saving. He looked at his drink. He did not trust you with the map because you were perfect. He trusted you with his daughter because he thought you could become someone worthy of that. There is a difference. Callum said nothing. Webb said, what you do now matters more than what you did 8 months ago. That is all I can tell you. On the third day, Callum went back to his office and opened a new file on his computer. He typed the name Nora Voss. He looked at the blank document. The cursor blinked. He had files on hundreds of people. Some were thick with information going back decades. Some were sparse but contained exactly the right data points. He sat there for a long time. Then he closed the document without typing anything in it. He left it closed. Not deleted, just empty. For the first time in 11 years, he was choosing to not know in advance. Meanwhile, in the service apartment 3 blocks away, Nora was at the kitchen table with the map spread in front of her and a notebook of her own to one side. Eli was on the floor. Mara was attempting to train a stuffed animal to do tricks it was clearly not designed to perform. She had spent the first day being angry. The second day she had spent thinking. By the third day she had arrived somewhere else. She went back through everything. Not the map. Her father. The way he had built his whole life around a work that his daughter was not allowed to know about. The way he had prepared her for a world he refused to show her. The years he had spent mapping Callum Reyes, tracking the arc of a man who had started in one place and was moving, slowly, in another direction. Edmund Voss was not a naive man. He had seen what Callum was capable of. He had documented it carefully. And he had still, at the end of his life, directed his daughter toward this person. Her father made very deliberate choices. He did not make emotional ones. She thought about what it meant that Edmund had put a piece of the evidence in Boston. Not to endanger Jake. To ensure that Jake would eventually understand. That eventually, Nora would have to tell him. That the family secret would have to become something shared. Her father had been trying to tell her something through the structure of the map itself. Not just follow these coordinates, but also stop carrying things alone. Stop protecting the people you love by keeping them in the dark. On the evening of the third day, Jake called. She answered on the second ring. Jake said, Nora, straight answer. What is happening? She said, how much do you know? He said, I know 2 people have been very carefully not letting me walk anywhere alone for 3 days. I know someone tried to get my address from the building office, and I know you have not called me in over a week, which means you are in something and you are deciding whether to tell me. She said, Dad left something behind, something important, and there are people who want it. He said, does this have to do with what he actually did? The work he never talked about. She said, yes. He said, is it dangerous? She said, it was. It is getting less dangerous. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Nora, Dad trusted you with this. Not because there was no one else, because he believed you were the right person. You should trust that. She said, I do trust that. I am working on trusting the other people involved. Jake said, the person who has people watching over me, is that the same person you are working with? She said, yes. He said, tell me one thing. Does Dad's map say anything good about him? A pause. She thought about the section where Callum's name appeared, the marker Edmund had used. She had decoded it on the second day. It was the word for protected, for safeguarded, for a coordinate that was fixed and reliable. She said, yes, actually, it does. Jake said, then trust Dad's judgment. He was not wrong about people. She said, he was wrong about whether to tell people things. Jake almost laughed. He said, true, but who isn't? Senator Mast moved on day 4. He used his connection to the State Attorney General's office to request that the Hargrove Institute surrender any documents related to Edmund Voss that might be relevant to an ongoing financial investigation. It was legal. It was exactly the kind of move that looked like due process and would result in Edmund's archived materials disappearing into a federal evidence locker for years. Callum found out within 2 hours. He made a decision. He contacted 3 investigative journalists, not the same network. 3 different ones, different organizations, different areas of focus. He provided each of them with a brief summary of Marcus Webb's testimony about Mast's connection to Edmund's death, cross-referenced with 2 financial anomalies he had been tracking for 18 months that were now documentable. Not a full story, not enough to publish, enough to make Mast understand that there were people watching who could not be silenced the way Edmund had been silenced. Mast's request to the Hargrove Institute was quietly withdrawn the following morning. It was a delay, not a solution. The solution still required what Edmund had built. 7 pieces, 7 locations, a map only one person could read, and a plan for what to do with it once it was assembled. Callum sat at his desk in the empty office and acknowledged, with the honesty he applied to operational assessments, what he had been avoiding for 3 days. He needed her, not the map, her, and he had no right to ask. She came on the morning of the 7th day, no call ahead. He heard the elevator from his desk. He heard the particular sound of a stroller wheel on the lobby floor, which he had not heard in 7 days, and which he recognized the way you recognize a sound you did not know you had been listening for. Phil's voice, downstairs, greeting her warmly, the sound of the door. He put his notebook down. She came through the door with Eli on her hip and Mara walking beside her. Mara saw the room and marched directly to Callum's chair and climbed up into it. Mara said, "Callum's chair." Callum said, "That's right." He looked at Nora. She was standing in the doorway with her coat still on, one hand on the doorframe. She said, "I have 2 conditions." He said, "Tell me." She said, "1. Any information that affects our safety, you tell me immediately, not after you calculate what I need to know, immediately." He said, "Agreed." She said, 2. When this is over, I want to know everything about my father. Not a summary. Everything. What he did, and why, and what you know about how he lived. I am his daughter. I have that right. He said, "Agreed." She looked at him for a moment. Then she came into the room and took off her coat and put it over the back of her chair. Her chair, the specific one she had always used. She said, "I am not saying I have forgiven you." He said, "I am not asking you to." She said, "I am saying I understand why you made the choice you made. I think you were wrong, and I think you know you were wrong." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is enough to keep working." Eli, who had been observing this exchange from his mother's hip with the expression of a small person assessing a complex situation, reached out one hand and touched Callum's shoulder briefly, then looked away as though he had not done it. Callum looked at that small hand for just a moment. Then he turned back to the desk. He said, "Let me show you where we are." They worked for 3 hours and then had to move. One of the Chicago evidence locations was in a building that the mass camp had already identified. Callum's contact told him that morning. They had less than 48 hours before someone else would attempt to access it. Callum had a plan. Nora read the plan and found a gap in it. She said, "The loading entrance on the east side. There is a camera with a partial view of the interior corridor. Your plan goes in from the west. If anyone is watching from a building across the street, they will see you." He said, "The west entrance is the secure approach." She said, "The east entrance is the invisible approach. They are not the same thing." He looked at her. He looked at the floor plan he had sketched. He crossed out his route and redrew it. He said, "You have been thinking about this." She said, "I have been doing this for 8 months alone. You learn to think like someone who does not want to be seen." The retrieval went cleanly. In and out in 11 minutes. The documents were exactly where Edmund's map had said they would be. sealed in waterproof packaging, labeled in her father's handwriting, organized with the precision of a man who had imagined this moment for years and wanted to make it as easy as possible for whoever came to find them. Nora held the package for a moment before she put it in the bag. She thought about her father sealing it, choosing where to put it, trusting that someday someone would come. She put it in the bag. That evening, Callum made a call to Jake. He did not tell Nora he was going to do it. He just did it. He introduced himself. He explained briefly what he was doing and why, and told Jake that the piece of Edmund's archive in Boston needed to be retrieved and secured. He told him exactly where it was and what to do with it. Jake said, "Why are you calling me directly?" Callum said, "Because you have a right to be part of this. Your father's work belongs to your family, not just to your sister." Jake said, "Did Nora ask you to call?" He said, "No." A pause. Jake said, "Okay, tell me what I need to do." Jake found the Boston material in 2 hours. He messaged Nora. He said, "I got it. Dad really hid things in weird places." Then he said, "Also, that guy called me. He is either the most intense person I have ever spoken to, or he is just from Chicago." Nora said, "Both." That night, Nora found the letter. Not in the map, separate. Tucked inside the back cover of a book Edmund had donated to the Hargrove Archive 18 months before he died, under a call number that corresponded to her employee ID. She had been working through the supplemental archive materials all week, looking for any secondary notes her father might have embedded. She found the letter at 10 p.m. with the children asleep and Callum at his desk across the room. She read it twice. Then she said, "I found something." He looked up. She said, "My father left a letter, in the archive, filed under my number." She set it on the table. He listed the most important things he had ever mapped. He said it was not the evidence, not the network, not the 20 years of documentation. He said the most important things he had ever mapped were the people worth protecting. Callum waited. She said, "He listed 3 names." She said, "Me, Jake." A pause. "And you?" Callum did not speak. She said, "He did not list you because you are perfect. He listed you because he had spent 15 years watching you and he believed there was something in you worth protecting, even after you let him down." Callum looked at the table. After a long moment, he said, "He should not have trusted me that much." She said, "Maybe not, but he did." She looked directly at him. "And for what it is worth, I am starting to think he was right." Neither of them moved. The quiet in the room was not the quiet of absence. It was the quiet of 2 people who had been talking around something for a long time and had finally gotten close enough to the center of it that words were no longer the right tool. He reached across the table. He placed his hand over hers. She did not pull away. They stayed like that for a while. The last 6 days moved quickly. All 7 pieces of Edmund's evidence came together. Jake handled Boston. Callum's people secured the New York and Springfield locations. Nora personally retrieved the Milwaukee piece on a day trip with Dorian, standing in a storage unit on the south side of the city that her father had rented, under a name she had never heard, opening a locked box with a key she had found sewn into the lining of the same travel bag she had carried out of Milwaukee, and finding everything exactly as he had organized it. He had organized it, knowing she would be the one to open it. She stood in that storage unit for a few minutes, alone. She put her hands on the box and she thought about her father. About the years he had spent building something that he could not tell his daughter about. About the way he had loved her, which was never quite in the language she would have chosen, but which was, she now understood, as complete as love gets. She said, "Okay, Dad, I see it." She packed the materials and closed the unit and walked back out into the Milwaukee morning. With everything assembled, the full picture of what Edmund had built was visible at last. It was not a weapon, it was a record. 20 years of documentation showing the financial architecture behind political decisions that had shaped Chicago and Illinois. Not just masked, though masked was the clearest case. A network, a way that certain money moved, and certain careers were supported, and certain investigations found reasons to close. Edmund had mapped all of it, not with malice, with the precision of a cartographer who understood that the most important maps are the ones that show what people cannot see from the ground. Nora sat with Callum at his office, and they went through it together for 2 full evenings. She read it as an archivist. He read it as someone who had been living adjacent to this network for years. What emerged was something that was larger than either of them had expected. She said, "He did not build this to destroy anyone." Callum said, "I know." She said, "He built it to ensure the truth could not be made to disappear." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then that is what we do with it." The question was where, not the press. A story this size would be attacked immediately, and Mast had enough institutional relationships to keep it buried in competing coverage. Not law enforcement, not at this stage. The same relationships that had closed Edmund's homicide case in 72 hours were still in place. The archive. Nora knew it before she fully said it. The Hargrove Institute. Edmund's life work had been donated to that institution piece by piece for 30 years. It was the natural home for his most important work, catalogued as historical documents, sealed with restricted access conditions, available to future researchers with the right credentials when the political landscape had changed enough for it to matter. Not a bomb, a time capsule, with a very specific detonator. Callum looked at her when she explained this. He said, "It will not take Mast down today." She said, "No, but it will not disappear either, and Mast will know it exists. That is enough." He said, "That is a very patient strategy." She said, "My father spent 20 years building it. Patience is in the design." Callum met Senator Mast on a Wednesday morning at a hotel conference room Mast used for private meetings. He arrived before Mast. He sat facing the door. When Mast came in, Callum did not stand. He placed a folder on the table. He said, "This is a summary of what Edmund Voss built over 20 years. The full collection is now in a sealed archive with restricted access." Mast looked at the folder without opening it. He said, "What do you want?" Callum said, "Nothing from you. I am telling you what exists. Sealed for 25 years. After that, it enters the historical record." Mast said, "And if I move against the people involved in this?" Callum looked at him steadily. He said, "Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something that protected the people of this city. I am continuing that. What I expose about myself in the process is secondary to what I protect." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "If you move against Nora Voss, her brother, anyone in my network, or anyone at the Hargrove Institute, everything Edmund built goes public, not into the archive, to every journalist and federal contact I have spent 11 years cultivating, tomorrow morning." Mast said, "You would expose your own organization." Callum said, "I would, yes." Mast was quiet for a long time. He looked at the folder. He looked at Callum. Then he stood up and left without taking the folder. That evening, Callum came to the archive. Nora was there alone, the children asleep at the apartment with Dorian watching over them. She was preparing the final cataloging of Edmund's materials, working under the single light at her archiving desk, the way she had worked alone for years. He came in with coffee. Right kind, no asking. He had learned her order in the first 48 hours. She said, "Is it done?" He said, "Mast will not move. The materials are secure." She exhaled. She set down her pen. He placed the coffee beside her. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the one she kept there for researchers who needed to consult with her in the archive. He had sat in it before. It had his shape in it now in the particular way chairs acquire a person's shape. She reached under her desk and brought out a small box. Sealed, labeled in Edmund's handwriting, with a call number she had found in the back of the letter. She put it in front of Callum. She said, "He left one more thing, catalogued under my number but marked with your access credentials. His journals, 20 years, everything he thought but did not encode into the maps." Callum looked at the box. She said, "He filed them for you. He knew you would be here." A silence. He said, "He mapped everything." She said, Everything worth keeping. He put his hand on the box. He did not open it. He held it the way you hold something you are not sure is real yet and need to confirm. Then he looked up at her. He said, "Nora, what do you want? When this is finished, what do you actually want?" She thought about it, genuinely. She said, "I want to keep doing what I do, organizing things, preserving what people leave behind, understanding what the gaps in a record mean." She paused. "What about you?" He said, "I want to stop knowing everything in advance. I want to start from not knowing and find out." She said, "That sounds terrifying." He said, "It is." She looked at him. The archive was quiet around them. The smell of old paper and the amber light from the window, and the particular silence that fills a room full of documents after hours. She said, "There is a research consultant position opening at the Institute, someone who can read patterns in historical records and connect them to present behavior." He said, "That sounds like something I could do." She said, "The pay is not good." He said, "I do not need the pay." She said, "I know." She looked at him. "I am not offering you a salary. I am offering you a reason to show up somewhere every day where someone will notice if you do not." He looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up, and he came around the desk, and he placed his hand against her face, the way you touch a map you have been trying to read for years, carefully, as though confirming that it is real and that you are reading it correctly. She did not move away. He said, "I will show up." She said, "I know you will." Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in November, which is trying to remind you that the summer was beautiful and the winter will be long, and the time between them is precious. The window light caught the edges of the archived boxes on the shelves. 34,000 documents, a city's worth of things worth keeping. Edmund's box sat on the desk between 2 cups of coffee. His journals, 20 years. She thought about her father, young, sitting in a library on Tuesday evenings, arguing about medieval maps with an old Polish man and a younger version of the person standing beside her now. She thought about the code he had taught her when she was 9, bedtime stories with hidden coordinates, a language he had been building for a purpose he could not yet name. She thought about Eli on a park bench with his hand balled into a fist even in sleep. Mara demanding dramatic emphasis. The particular weight of a child who trusts you completely, asleep on your shoulder. She picked up her coffee. She went back to work. He sat down across from her. He opened Edmund's box. He began to read. 6 months later, the second desk in the archive was just part of the room. It had a notebook on it, and a pen, and no laptop. A cup of coffee, the size Callum drank, a shelf above it where he had begun organizing secondary research materials by a system that was, Nora had noted, a variation on her father's system with his own modifications built in. He came 3 afternoons a week, sometimes 4. He was not on the Institute's payroll. His name did not appear on any staff directory. But Phil held the door without being asked, and Dennis from the reading room always made sure the coffee machine had been recently run before 2 in the afternoon. And the board of directors had approved a research consultation arrangement without asking too many questions about the consultant's background. Eli was 2.5. He had opinions about many things now, including which books Callum read adequately and which required additional instruction. He had a whole system for evaluating whether a day was going to be a good day, which appeared to involve observing which way the kitchen curtains moved in the morning light. He could not yet explain the system to anyone but himself, but the system worked. On days Callum was not coming, Eli accepted this information stoically. On days Callum was, he stood near the door approximately 12 minutes before Callum was expected. Nobody had told him the schedule. He had learned it. Mara had graduated Callum to what she described as a passing level of dramatic reading. He was still not great at the lion voice. She had decided this was acceptable given his otherwise satisfactory qualities. Jake came for a long weekend in the middle of May. He brought a bottle of wine and a very large amount of the kind of food that suggested he had been cooking for a week in preparation. He and Callum sat across from each other at dinner and conducted what Nora recognized as a mutual assessment that both of them were performing too casually to fool anyone. Jake said, "The paper I'm working on. It's about the use of historical cartographic records as evidence in property rights disputes." Callum said, "Edmund wrote about that intersection in his fourth journal. I can set aside the relevant sections if it would help." Jake looked at him, then at Nora, then back at Callum. He said, "That would actually be very helpful. Thank you." After dinner, when the children were asleep and Callum had stepped out to take a brief call, Jake sat with Nora at the kitchen table. He said, "Dad would have liked him." Nora said, "Dad did like him. Dad spent 15 years documenting it." Jake laughed. He said, "Fair point." She said, "I know it is strange. I know the situation is strange." He said, "Nothing about our family was ever normal, Nora. Dad made maps for the mob. You are an archivist who decoded a secret cipher. I am writing a dissertation about property law. Strange is just the weather." She laughed. She did not laugh enough, she had been told. She was working on it. One Tuesday evening, Nora was closing up the archive alone. The routine was the same as it had been for years. Lights off in rows, back to front. She walked the familiar path from shelf to shelf the way she had walked it hundreds of times, through every season, every kind of day. The archive had been the most constant place in her life for a long time. It still was, just differently. Eli and Mara were asleep in the small office off the main reading room, arranged on the fold-out cot Dorian had brought over 3 months ago, after the second time Callum had needed to work late, and the children had simply fallen asleep, and no one had thought to move them. Callum was at his desk with Edmund's 7th journal open. She turned off the last light. The room went into the particular amber dark of evening light through tall windows, the city outside still moving, the archive still. She said, "Ready." He closed the journal. He stood. He put his coat on. She walked toward the door through the dark she knew as well as any lighted room. She checked the children once, briefly, a hand on each of them, the habit of 3 years that was now also the habit of 6 more months. She picked up the bag. He picked up the stroller. They went out together. Phil locked the door behind them. Outside, the city was doing its evening thing. Traffic and voices and the smell of rain coming in off the lake. Mara stirred in the stroller and said something unintelligible and went back to sleep. Eli's hand, even asleep, was wrapped around the bar of the stroller in the particular grip that still made Callum think of the first night in the car, the first time he had looked at that small fist and understood that the world had been different from what he thought. They walked toward the parking garage. 3 blocks. The kind of distance that in November was brief and bracing and not unpleasant. Nora said, "I found another Edmund notation today, in the Milwaukee file. He listed you with a symbol I had not seen him use before." Callum said, "What symbol?" She said, "It is the one he reserved for things he expected to still be standing when everything else had changed. He used it for load-bearing walls, for archive foundations, for the things that hold the structure up." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "He was optimistic." She said, "He was right." They walked on. The city moved around them the way cities do, enormous and indifferent and full of the particular kind of energy that comes from millions of people making decisions that all somehow add up to something. The arc of all that Edmund had built was behind them now in a sealed archive, not destroyed, not weaponized, preserved, available to the future in the form the future would need it. Her father's faith in record-keeping, in the idea that the truth properly kept could outlast whatever came against it. She had inherited that faith. She understood it now in a way she could not have understood it 3 years ago, or 8 months ago, or even 6 months ago. She understood it because she had spent the last 6 months watching what it looked like when someone with a different kind of faith was learning to change directions. When the man who had built his life on knowing everything in advance was learning to walk into territory that had no map. It was not a clean or comfortable process. It was slow and occasionally confusing, And there were evenings when the old habits reasserted themselves, and he would answer a question she had not asked yet, or redirect a conversation toward a conclusion he had already reached. And she would point this out, and he would acknowledge it, and they would start again. That was how it went. Not one transformation, a series of choices, repeated, in the direction of something better. Her father had believed Callum was capable of that. Her father had been right. Later that night, when the children were asleep and the apartment was quiet, Nora sat at the kitchen table with Edmund's letter in front of her. She had read it many times. She kept coming back to the last paragraph, which was brief. It said, "I spent a long time believing that the most important cartographer's work was to map the territory accurately. I spent longer understanding that the most important work was to map it for someone specific, to say, here is where the road is, and here is the danger, and here is where I believe you will be standing when you read this. My darling, meticulous, unfrightened daughter, you are standing exactly where I hoped you would be." She folded the letter. She thought about the word unfrightened. She had been frightened, in fact, many times in the last year. She had been frightened in the park and on the train and in the Milwaukee apartment and in Callum's office on the night she walked out of it. She had been frightened, and she had continued anyway, which was, she supposed, what her father had always meant by that word. The archive held 34,000 documents. It held her father's work, and Edmund's journals, and 20 years of a city's hidden history. It held, in a sealed box with restricted access, the evidence that would outlast the people it implicated and the people it vindicated. It held, in no file and no catalog, the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon when a man who had spent 11 years certain of everything was learning to be uncertain about the right things. That, too, was part of the record. That, too, was worth keeping. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to check the children, Eli with his fist, and Mara boneless and trusting. She adjusted a blanket. She stood in the dark doorway for a moment. Then she went to the room where Callum was reading, and she sat beside him, and they were quiet together in the particular way that only exists between two people who have, without announcement, decided that whatever comes next, they will face it from the same direction. Her father had mapped this too. He had mapped it first. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
There is a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. It is not the confrontation. It is not the evidence, or the senator, or the danger. It is a much smaller moment. A 2-year-old boy sitting on a kitchen floor, holding out a toy truck to a man he has never met. Not giving it, just showing it. This is what I have. What do you have? And the most powerful information broker in Chicago crouches down and says quietly, "That is a good truck." That is the whole story, right there, in 8 words. Because this story was never really about a map. It was about what people choose to protect, and what that choice costs them, and what it means when they finally get it right. Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something important. But the real lesson from Edmund is not about courage or sacrifice. It is about a mistake that intelligent, well-meaning people make all the time. He believed that protecting the people he loved meant keeping them in the dark. He thought silence was safety. He thought if Nora did not know the danger, she could not be touched by it. He was wrong, and his silence cost him everything, including the years he could have spent trusting his daughter with the truth. Callum made the same mistake. A man who built his entire life on knowing everything, on never being caught without information, withheld the one thing that mattered most from the one person who deserved it. He told himself it was strategic. The truth was simpler and harder than that. He was afraid, not of the danger, of being seen for the mistake he had already made. And Nora, she left 3 years ago, not because she was weak, but because she understood something that took Callum 11 years on a park bench in a Chicago winter to begin to learn. Protecting someone and controlling what they know are two completely different things. Real protection means trusting people with the truth, even when the truth is difficult, even when you are not sure they can handle it, even when it would be easier to decide for them. That is the first lesson. Respect the people you love enough to tell them the truth. The second lesson is this: a person's real character is not revealed in their best moments. It is revealed in what they do when no one is watching and nothing is required of them. Callum did not have to call Jake. He did not have to sit on the floor and read a giraffe book 4 times. He did not have to open Edmund's journals and learn a dead man's language. Nobody asked him to. He did it anyway. That is who he was becoming, not who he had been, who he was choosing to be. And the third lesson, the one Edmund built into the map itself, is perhaps the most important of all. The truth, properly kept, outlasts everything that tries to bury it. Not today, not loudly, not in the way that makes headlines, but quietly, in an archive, in a sealed box, in a record that waits patiently for the moment when it can finally matter. Your father's honesty, your mother's courage, the small daily choices you make when no one is watching, these things do not disappear. They accumulate. They build something that can hold weight long after you are gone. Nora's father mapped a city, but what he was really mapping, all along, was a direction for his daughter, for a man he believed could still change, and for 2 small children he never got to meet, who were going to need to know where everything important was kept. He was right about all of it. He usually was.